In our last video, we talked about the relationship that fungi might have with themselves and with other organisms, and of which we call that kind of relationship symbiosis. And we said that symbiosis is subdivided into commensalism, into amensalism, mutualism, parasitism, predation, and saprophytism. And of which we said saprophytism and parasitism are a kind of symbiotic relationship that fungi undergo with other organisms in order to get food. In other words, fungi undergo parasitism and saprophytism as a means of nutrition because fungi as organisms does not produce their own food by themselves. Hence, we say that they undergo heterodytic kind of nutrition. Then we also picked mutualism. And we said that fungi undergo mutualism with plant roots to form mycorrhiza and can also undergo relationship with algae to form lichen. In mycorrhizae, fungi makes up about 10% of the composition, while the plant root makes about 80%. Whereas in lichen, fungi makes about 90% of the lichen, while algae makes about 10% of the lichen. Algae is also called the phycobiont, while the fungi is called the mycobiont. Take note of that. So in today's class, we'll be talking more about lichen. So we are starting with the habitation or the habitat of lichen. Lichen possess a quite number of habitats or can be found in a quite number of places, which includes on soil, on the bark of trees, on twigs, on rocks, moss, and leaves, basically the green leaves. When they are found on soil, we call them terricolous lichen. When found on bark of trees, probably fallen trees or tree trunk, we call them corticolous lichen. When found on twigs, we call them ramicolous. And when found on rock, we call them saxicolous. And those that grow on a moss is called mossicolous. And those that grow on leaves are called folicolous. So for this list, we gave it an acronym for students to remember with, which means that the terrestrial world, which is the earth, is made up of Christians and also Muslims. So Christians take CRS, while this represents the Muslims. That makes sense. Which means that whenever I write the word terrestrial, which is the earth, we have two most populous religion, which is Christians that takes CRS as a subject, and we have the Muslims. These are the two most populous religion on earth. So terrestrial means the earth. So once I pick the T tell me terricolous, C tell me corticolous, R tell me ramicolous, S tells me saxicolous, and I have the musci, which tells me musicolous. And the last one couldn't make it to into the acronym, which is folicolous. All right, moving forward, we have classification of lichen. Lichen generally are classified based on their appearance, based on their association with fungi, and based on how they grow, their growth form. Okay, based on their appearance, we have crustose lichen and we have fruticose lichen. And based on their association with fungi, we have ascolichen and we have basidiolichen. Ascolichen and basidiolichen. Ascolichen means lichen undergoing association with Ascomycota. Ascomycota are actually also called the sac fungi. An example is Aspergillus. All right, we also have basidiolichen. Basidiolichen are formed as a result of association of Basidiomycota or Basidiomycetes and lichen. An example of Basidiomycota is the mushroom, and Basidiomycota are actually called the club fungi. Then we have lichen based on their growth form. We have the leprous lichen, we have the squamous, we have the dimorphic, and we have the placodioid lichen. But most importantly, let's move to classification or what we call taxonomy of fungi. All right, when we talk about taxonomy, what do we mean? We are actually talking about the classification of fungi, how they are classified botanically. This classification is actually given an acronym called KPIC of GS. K represents kingdom, P represents phylum, or what you call division. Then the C represents class, O represents order, and we have G representing genus. And the last one is the species. So for kingdom, we have fungi, since we're dealing with fungi. But then, don't forget that we talked about fungi being classified under plants, and it is basically classified under the Talophyta. Now, let me make this clarification. You see, fungi is not actually a plant, but it is placed under the plant kingdom, specifically under Talophyta, because its body parts cannot be differentiated into leaf, stem, and roots. Hence, it is made up of thallus. And so, whenever you see fungi classified under the plant kingdom, it is because it is classified under the Talophyta, but not majorly because it is a plant. And also, fungi does not make its own food. In other words, they cannot photosynthesize. So they do not fit into the plant kingdom at all. Only that their body is made up of thallus, which means that they cannot be differentiated into root, stem, and leaf. Then we have their phylum, or what you call division. Fungi are made up of three major divisions. We have the Oomycota, which are also known as the egg fungi. They are called the egg fungi because they make oospore, and that oospore looks like an egg. Example of Oomycota is the Phytophthora. We have the Pythium debranum, and we have Saprolegma. Then the next one is the Myzomycota. Myzomycota are actually made up of a particular example called the slide modes. Then the last one is the Oomycota, or what we call the through fungi. So in brief, we have three divisions. We have the Oomycota, the Myzomycota, and we have the Eumycota. Since we've dealt with the kingdom and the phylum, we have the class. Each phylum, which is Oomycota, Myzomycota, and Eumycota, actually have their respective class. That is, when you divide them further, when you go into the study further, you see that each of them have subdivisions or you call class. So for the subdivision of Oomycota, these ones have no further division, which means that they have no class. Then we have the Myzomycota. This is not myco, it is Myzomycota. So Myzomycota, there are about 4 basic classes. Now, as times goes by, as you open through erudite tomes like scholarly books, you are likely to have more classes because there have been advancements over the years. In short, this classification differs from one book to another, and hence the study I'm undergoing with you is actually for the basic A-level classification. But in the course of making further research, if you see other classes, please don't disregard them. All right, we have the first class, which is the Mycomyces, and we have the next one, which is the Erastomyces. Then we have the next one, which is class 3. We have the Plasmodiophyomycetes. Then we have the next class, which is the fourth class, called Hydromyzomycetes. Now, you see these two divisions are not as important as the Eumycota. In fact, focus is usually paid to the Eumycota as regards exam setting and the likes of it. So for Eumycota, this is the most important division of fungi. So which means that as a student, there is no how you can dodge questions on the Eumycota. I advise that you study the Eumycota very well. Just know that there are 3 divisions of fungi: Oomycota, Myzomycota, and Eumycota. Then focus basically on the Eumycota. So what's the Eumycota talking about? We have about 4 classes. We have the Zygomycetes, we have the Basidiomycetes, we have the Ascomycetes, and we have the Deuteromycetes, or what you call Zygomycota, Basidiomycota, Ascomycota, and Deuteromycota. For the Zygomycetes, or what you call Zygomycota, we have the mucor, we have rhizopus as notable examples. For Basidiomycota, we have agaricus, which is called the mushroom. Then for Ascomycota, or what you call the sac fungi, we have the aspergillus. Now note that all these classes that are listed here are actually under the division Eumycota. And so because the Eumycota are actually also called the true fungi, it tells us that all this class here are actually true fungi. But let's take a study on the Deuteromycota. You see, the Deuteromycota are actually true fungi, but then they are also known as fungi imperfecti, not because they are not true fungi, but because their life cycle are incomplete, or we say that they have an imperfect life cycle. And an example of the Deuteromycota or the fungi imperfecti is actually Heminthosporium. Now, in summary, we've talked about the habitation or the habitat of lichen, and we said that the habitat of lichen has an acronym T, which is terrestrial, equals to CRS plus MOS, right? Where we have terricolous, We have the corticolous, we have the ramicolous, S stands for saxicolous, and M here stands for musicolous, musci. And the last one is follicular that I couldn't get into the acronym. And we said that terricolous is for fungi that are found on soil. We said the saxicolous are fungi found on rocks. Corticolous are fungi found on bark of trees. We also said ramicolous are actually found on twigs. We have the musicolous, which are usually found on moss. And the last one, we have the folliculous, which are usually found around green leaves. And the next thing we picked before talking about the taxonomy, we picked the classification of leaching. And we said that leaching is classified into three. The classification based on their appearance. We talked about the classification based on their association with fungi. And lastly, we talked about their growth form. And lastly, we talked about the taxonomy. And for the taxonomy, we have K pick of GS. So K is telling us kingdom, and we said that the kingdom we're dealing with currently is fungi. We have the phylum, and we said there are about three phylum. We have Umycota, Mycota, and we have Emycota. We also talk about the classes, and we said that the Umycota possess no class. But here we have about four classes here, and for Emycota we have about four classes here too. But we treated this Emycota as most important, and we said that the four classes must be known by every student who seek to actually pass Jupeb, IJMP, or Cambridge A-level. And so our major focus will be on the zygomycota, the basidiomycota, the ascomycota, and the deuteromycota. But before we take the characteristics of each of these classes one after the other, let's quickly discuss the mode by which fungi colonizes its host. In other words, mode of colonization of hosts in fungi. This colonization actually teaches us how fungi behaves when in a host or when associating with other organisms. Now, this colonization is in three modes. The first one is biotroph. So when we refer a fungi has a biotroph, what do we mean? It means that the fungi is actually a parasite. And the kind of parasite it is actually an obligate parasite. And when we say obligate parasite, we mean it does not undergo any other form of nutrition or have any other way by which it feeds other than parasitism. Biotrophs in relationship with other organisms actually grow and reproduce in that organism, that is, in their host, using a specialized structure called the hostoria. The hostoria is used to absorb nutrients from the host, and that is how they live as a biotroph until the host dies. All right, examples of fungi that are classified under the biotrophs are actually as follows. Number one, we have the Clodosporium fulvum. Clodosporium fulvum is a kind of fungi that actually causes leaf mold in tomatoes. Now, what does that leaf mold means, or how can we perceive it? If you check the leaves of tomatoes, that's uninfected tomatoes, provided you have one around, you observe a kind of discoloration on their leaves. Then the next one is Ustilago. Ustilago causes smooth disease. Okay. And the next one is Peronospora albuginea. Peronospora albuginea causes mildew and white rust. For white rust, is usually visible on leaves, especially green leaves, as something whitish, right? It's just like an infection on leaves. Okay, then we have the next one, which is necrotrophs. Necrotrophs are actually saprophytes, which means that they undergo the saprophytic mode of nutrition that feed on dead organic matter. Example is Pythium. But then don't forget that Pythium can actually undergo two kinds of nutrition, right? Which is saprophytic and they are also parasitic. Then the last mode of colonization is actually hemibiotrophs. For hemibiotrophs, they're actually facultative parasites, which means that they are actually parasites, but then they can feed on both dead organic matter. In other words, they can become saprophytic despite they are parasitic. Do you understand? Depending on whether the living host is alive or not. When alive, they behave as parasitic, which means that they behave as the biotrophs. But when the host becomes dead, they take a saprophytic lifestyle, which means that when dead, they still feed on the host. Example is Phytophthora, and we have the Pythium debrianum. And lastly, we'll be taking the characteristics of each of the class of fungi. And don't forget that this class of fungi that we're talking about is actually falling under division Eumycota, which happens to be the most important division for A level. So we have the first class, which is the Zygomycota. Zygomycota actually possess the following characteristics. The first one is that they are aseptate, they possess aseptate mycelium, or what we call aseptate hyphae, which means that their hyphae does not possess cross walls. Hence, we are saying indirectly that they will possess continuous cytoplasm. Now, also note that the fact that they do not possess cross walls, it means that materials will easily be transported through their cells because there's no cross wall that would hinder a material that enters into a portion of their body parts. Do you understand? Hence, continuous cytoplasm actually supports quick transportation of material within the cell. So that's an advantage of not having a cross wall or septate mycelium. Number two, we have sexual reproduction. Their sexual reproduction gives rise to a zygospore, and that zygospore is actually a thick cell walled and kind of dormant, which means that the cell wall will be playing a role just like an akinet, hence protecting the zygospore from harsh conditions like heat, desiccation, cold. Then the zygomycota possess asexual reproduction, and in this case, they produce spore, and this spore is actually the sporangiospore. Now, the sporangiospore is actually usually embedded in the sporangia. In subsequent lectures, we'll be explaining the meaning of each of these words, like sporangiospore, sporangia, zygospore, and the likes of it. So the fourth one are actually the examples that fall under the zygomycota. Then we have Basidiomycota. The Basidiomycota are actually also called the clock fungi. Now, these ones possess septate mycelium, which means that their cytoplasm is made up of cross walls, hence their cytoplasm is non-continuous. Then this mycelium can either be uninucleated or binucleated. In other words, it can be made up of one nucleus or two nucleus. Then we have number three, which is actually their asexual reproduction. During their asexual reproduction, they form what we call basidiospore. Then we have number four. There's something we call basidiocarp. Basidiocarp is actually making up their fruiting body. Now, what's the function of this basidiocarp? The basidiocarp actually serves as sexual spore formation or participates in the production of spore, but during sexual reproduction. Then examples we have the mushroom, we have the tough balls. Quickly note that this basidiophore is actually found on some specialized cells called the basidia. And the next one we have is the ascomycota, or what you call the sac fungi. Alright, for the ascomycota, they possess septate mycelium, which means that they possess crossed wall in their cytoplasm. Then they undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction. And their fruiting body actually bears asci. But that fruiting body is actually made up of ascocarp that bears asci. That will be during sexual reproduction. But then note that this fruiting body of Basidiomycota is actually called basidiocarp, and it bears basidiospore. And here we have the fruiting body of Ascomycota to be called ascocarp, which bears the ascis. Then we have Deuteromycota. The Deuteromycota are actually also called the fungi imperfecti. Then their characteristics. They possess septate mycelium. Their mycelium usually penetrates through the living host, right, in parasitic form, which means that if this class of fungi undergo association with plant roots, they're actually going to form an endomycorrhizae. And the third one is the fungi imperfecti are usually parasitic in nature. We've said this earlier that they have incomplete life cycle and they undergo asexual reproduction. A prominent example is Heminthosporium and Fusarium. Alright, in summary, for the characteristics of the phylum Mycota, we said we have the first, which is the Zygomycota. Another name the Zygomycota are actually called is the conjugated fungi, which means that they undergo conjugation the most for their reproduction. The Zygomycota are the only ones in this class that we discussed so far that possess aseptate mycelium. And then another thing we talked about the zygomycota is that they undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction, whereby they produce zygospore, which is usually a thick cell wall. Not only possessing a thick cell wall, it's also dormant in nature, which is almost looking like an archinet in algae. And the next thing we talked about their asexual reproduction, and of which we said they produce spore, and the name of the spore is sporangiospore. And lastly, we gave examples. And the next thing we talked about is the Basidiomycota. And we said that the Basidiomycota are actually called the club fungi. For the Basidiomycota, we said that they possess septates. In other words, their mycelium possess cross walls. Then we said that their mycelium can be uninucleated or it is binucleated. Okay, the next thing we talked about is that we talked about their fruiting body being the basidiocarp. And we said that the basidiocarp, which is their fruiting body, generates something we call basidiospore. An example is mushroom. The next one we talked about is actually the ascomycota. And we said that ascomycota are actually called the sac fungi. And we said that for the sac fungi, they are septate, which means that their mycelium possess cross walls. Hence, their cytoplasm is not continuous. Then we said that they undergo reproduction, and their reproduction can be sexual or it is asexual. Then we also said that they possess a fruiting body called the ascocarp, and that ascocarp makes something we call the asci, which is their spore. And we give examples. The examples are yeast and etc. And the last one we talked about is the deuteromycota. And we said another name for the deuteromycota is actually the fungi imperfecti. And we said for the fungi imperfecti, they are mostly parasitic. We said that they possess septate, mycelium, septate. Okay. Another thing we talked about them is that they have an incomplete, from the word imperfecti. It means that they have incomplete life cycle. And then we also mentioned that their septate mycelium can penetrate through the host of living things and so on forth. And lastly for this lecture, don't forget that we mentioned three phylum, but don't forget that I mentioned that as science revolves, fungi are further classified into new or recent phylum, and of which recent study shows that there is a phylum now called Tetradomycota, or what people call the chytrids. Alright, another phylum is the Glomerulomycota, and so on. I hope this helped. See you in the next one.